Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into the life and really the whirlwind of ideas surrounding Francois-Marie Arouet, better known to basically everyone as Voltaire.
Absolutely. A giant of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Born 1694, died 1778, lived his whole life practically in Paris.
Mm.
And what a life known for that incredible wit, but also, a fierce critic of things like slavery, the established church.
And a huge champion for religious freedom, free speech, separation of church and state. Core stuff we still grapple with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And incredibly prolific. Our source material today is actually kind of interesting. It's excerpts from his Vietnamese Wikipedia page.
Right, which gives a surprisingly good overview. So our mission here is to unpack Voltaire, using the source, his life, his massive body of work, his influence, basically get a handle on what made him tick based on this perspective.
Sounds good. Let's start at the beginning then, his background.
Yeah, Francois-Marie Arouet, born into a family. His dad was involved in tax administration, right? And his mother had noble connections.
That's right. So maybe not top-tier aristocracy, but definitely connected, probably opened some doors.
And the education Jesuits. So strong grounding in classics, Greek, Latin, but then he picked up English, Italian, Spanish later on.
Which must have been a huge advantage, broadening his horizons way beyond France. He worked as his secretary initially, apparently.
But writing was the real calling, and he wasn't shy about critiquing society, even early on.
No, definitely not. Which, predictably, landed him in hot water with the authorities. Led to that exile in England for, was it 3 years?
Yeah, and that seems crucial, a real turning point. He comes back and writes Lettres philosophiques, the philosophical letters on England. What did he see there that impressed him so much?
Well, compared to France at the time, England had a more limited monarchy, more room for different viewpoints, less rigid control. That really struck him.
So he contrasts that with the French system in the letters.
Pretty directly, yeah. Which, of course, caused a stir back home. Big debate, more trouble for him. After he got back, though, he found this intellectual haven at the Chateau de Cirey.
Ah, right, with Émilie du Châtelet.
Yes, a fascinating figure herself. She was married to the owner, but her bond with Voltaire was this intense intellectual partnership.
So Cirey becomes this hub of activity.
Absolutely. They built up a huge library, studied constantly. Our source mentions they even did natural science experiments together.
Wow. Shared interest in science, then. And Newton.
Definitely. Big admirers of Newton. They also dug into history together. Voltaire wrote his essay on the French Civil Wars then, and studied Louis XIV's reign.
What were they getting out of that history study?
Well, looking at power, leadership, Voltaire's work on King Carl XII of Sweden seems relevant here. He apparently admired Karl's victory over Peter the Great.
Interesting.
And it's around this time, studying history and rulers like Karl XII and his opponent August II of Poland, that Voltaire's anti-religious views started getting, let's say, sharper. He and du Châtelet also studied philosophy, metaphysics, the Bible.
Which led them to that shared belief in separating church and state.
Seems like it all fed into that conviction.
Yeah.
And this whole period at Cirey, this intense intellectual life, it really sets the stage for his later interactions with powerful rulers.
Like Frederick the Great. That's a big one.
Huge. Apparently, Frederick, even when he was just Crown Prince of Prussia, was a big fan of Voltaire's writing.
So they started corresponding early.
Yeah, the source says 1736. Voltaire initially praised him, saw him as this potential philosopher king, wrote poems for his coronation in 1740.
That ideal of the enlightened ruler. But Frederick turned out to be a bit more complicated than just a philosopher, didn't he?
Yeah. Seizing Silesia from Austria wasn't exactly a philosophical move. Reality kind of intruded.
How did Voltaire handle that? Did the relationship cool off?
Well, his initial hopes might have been, tempered a bit, but they kept writing, even during those early Silesian wars. And later, after Émilie du Châtelet tragically died, Voltaire actually went to live with Frederick in Prussia for a while.
Really? In Potsdam?
Yeah, he apparently called it a philosophical paradise at first, even had his own room at the palace. Seems like they were quite close, personally, for a time.
But Voltaire being Voltaire? He couldn't stay uncritical forever, right? What happened?
Well, there was the Diatribe de Docteur Akakia. It was this pretty biting critique of Maupertuis, who was heading Frederick's Berlin Academy.
And Frederick didn't like that.
Not at all. He saw it as undermining his academy, his patronage. It got quite heated, apparently. Voltaire ended up leaving Prussia.
So another departure under a cloud. Where did he go then?
Spent some time in Geneva, but then his book Candide came out in 1759, which included digs at Leibniz that caused more problems. He had to leave Geneva, too.
Seems like controversy followed him. But the connection with Frederick wasn't totally severed.
Amazingly, no. Our source suggests they reconciled through letters around 1753. There was still this underlying mutual respect, despite the clashes.
Even during the Seven Years' War, that must have been a tough time for Frederick.
Extremely tough. Prussia was really up against it. And Voltaire wrote to him, apparently urging him to keep his honor, which Frederick appreciated. They kept corresponding, Voltaire trying to understand Frederick's, I guess, resilience.
40 years of friendship,
Yeah,
despite all the ups and downs. That's quite something.
it really is. Just shows the power of that intellectual connection.
And Frederick wasn't the only powerful ruler he corresponded with. There was Catherine the Great of Russia, too.
Right. Another relationship built on mutual admiration, it seems. Catherine admired his genius, his foresight.
And he called her the Semiramis of the North.
He did, famously, a nod to this legendary, powerful queen. But interestingly, the source points out he didn't actually use that name in his letters to her.
Why not?
Well, Voltaire had written a tragedy called Semiramis, where the queen murders her husband to get the throne.
Ah, and Catherine had taken power after a coup against her husband, Peter III.
Exactly. So maybe a bit too close for comfort, even in private letters. Shows his political savvy, though.
Definitely. Did he support her politically?
Yes. He backed her campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and also the partitions of Poland in the 1770s. He called her Tamiris, too, another victorious queen figure.
Right.
And he was writing to English diplomats like William Hamilton as well. He was connected everywhere.
Okay, let's talk about his actual writing. The sheer volume is just staggering. Over 2,000 books and pamphlets, 20,000 letters.
It's almost unbelievable. Novels, plays, poetry, essays, history, science. He did it all.
Where do we see his core ideas coming through most clearly?
Well, his epic poem, Henriade, is a good example. It praised King Henry IV of France as this ideal, wise ruler focused on simplicity, economic growth, supporting arts and sciences. And the source says this actually influenced Frederick II.
And then there's religion. He's probably most famous for being critical, right?
Hugely critical, yes. But the source notes it wasn't always perhaps perfectly consistent.
How so?
Well, he argued you didn't need faith to believe in God. His was a rational belief. But then he was deeply skeptical about Christianity itself, questioned if Jesus even existed, the reliability of the Gospels, pointed out contradictions.
But he also acknowledged the church councils preserved those same texts.
Exactly. So there's a tension there.
Yeah.
Maybe it reflects his own evolving thoughts or the difficulty of expressing these views openly. We should also mention, as the source does, his writings included some pretty standard, unfortunately, anti-Semitic views for the era and views on indigenous peoples that wouldn't sit well today.
Right. Okay, moving to his philosophy. The Dictionnaire philosophique, the philosophical dictionary. That sounds major.
It was huge. Basically a collection of his articles, some from Diderot's encyclopedia, too.
Yeah.
It let him tackle everything, politics, religion, the Bible, in this accessible, witty, very Voltaire style.
Kind of an Enlightenment handbook.
In a way, yeah, challenging everything. He did believe religion had a role in moral education, but focused on ethics, not dogma. And philosophically, he was very much aligned with empiricists like Newton and Locke. Interestingly, he also opposed French colonization in North America.
What about his view of French society itself? The source paints a pretty critical picture.
Oh, definitely. He saw the bourgeoisie as weak, the aristocracy as corrupt, the common people as ignorant and superstitious. Even the church was problematic, maybe fueling unrest with its tithes. Not exactly a rosy view.
Doesn't sound like he had much faith in the average person. Very different from Rousseau, then.
Very different. He didn't trust democracy much. Either thought it led to mob rule, basically.
So what was his preferred system?
Enlightened despotism. The idea that a rational monarch, guided by philosophers like, well, himself, could bring about necessary reforms. That's why he invested so much in figures like Frederick and Catherine.
Even supporting their use of force sometimes, like with Poland?
Yes, the source indicates he did support the partition of Poland, seeing it as bringing order. He even urged Frederick to fight the Ottomans.
But Frederick refused, right? Said something like, let us live and let others live.
Exactly. Frederick had seen war firsthand in the 7 Years' War and was less keen than Voltaire, the armchair strategist who admired Karl XII's military wins.
But Voltaire himself wasn't pro-war in general, was he? Didn't he call it a hellish machine?
He did, in the Dictionnaire philosophique, called war initiators stupid murderers.
Ah.
So there's that contradiction again. He wanted progress and order, maybe saw force as a necessary evil in the hands of the right ruler, but hated the brutality of war itself.
Complex. But ultimately, his legacy is about rights, freedom.
Absolutely. Championing individual rights, religious freedom, fair trials, exposing the injustice of the old French system. That's what he's remembered for.
He spent his last years in Ferney, near the Swiss border, right? But died back in Paris.
Yes. And the accounts of his deathbed are, well, quite dramatic. Screams, visions. His supposed last words were, "For God's sake, let me die in peace."
Wow. A turbulent end to a turbulent life.
But his legacy lives on. Ferney is now Ferney Voltaire. His chateau is a museum. And his entire library is preserved in St. Petersburg, Russia. An incredible resource.
And people recognize his importance even then. Gareth called him the greatest writer of all time.
High praise indeed. Our source calls him one of history's outstanding historical geniuses. And his quotes, they still pack a punch.
Definitely. Like the one about revolutions not being made by big folios, but by little portable books at 30 sous.
Yeah.
The power of accessible ideas.
Or his incredibly blunt take on Christianity. The most ridiculous, the most absurd, and the most bloody that has ever infected the world. He didn't mince words.
And his line about justice. It is better to risk saving a guilty person than to condemn an innocent one. Still fundamental.
Plus that sharp question about fanaticism. The man who'll cut your throat, sure, he's obeying God. Still chillingly relevant.
Even his more pessimistic lines like, "We shall leave this world as foolish and as wicked as we found it."
Or his dismissive, "a few acres of snow," for French Canada.
Yeah.
Shows a certain pragmatic, maybe ruthless side too.
But also beautiful insights, like writing is the painting of the voice.
And one can judge the character of men by their enterprises. True enough. And of course, the famous one. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him.
So much packed into that single line about the social function of belief.
It really is.
Yeah.
And just to give a sense of the range, key works like Lettres philosophiques, Candide, Dictionnaire philosophique and philosophy.
Buzz like Adame, Zaire, Muhammad.
History like History of Charles XII, the Age of Louis XIV, the list goes on.
So wrapping up, Voltaire really was this intellectual powerhouse of the Enlightenment. Writer, philosopher, advocate. His impact is just immense.
Yeah, he fought tirelessly against oppression, championed reason, free speech, tolerance. In a very unfree, intolerant time, his critiques of fanaticism, his calls for justice, they still resonate so strongly today, don't they?
They absolutely do. It's been fascinating digging into his life and work, even just through the lens of this one particular source. A truly complex and enduring figure.
Definitely. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Voltaire came from privilege. He corresponded and even lived with absolute monarchs like Frederick and Catherine. How did those connections, that proximity to power, shape his critiques? Did it enable him in some ways, maybe allow him access and influence? Or did it perhaps limit how far he could or would go in challenging the fundamental structures of power? Something to think about.
A great question to end on. Join us next time for another deep dive.